Hi everyone, hopefully everyone can hear me okay. I think we're going to get underway. The majority of people who registered are on, so I think we'll get started. Firstly, welcome and thank you for attending this webinar. This is our fourth in a series of webinars on performance testing. Today we're building on the previous three sessions where we initially provided an overview and then we looked at creating a performance test environment, and then last time we looked at building load profiles. Today we're going to be bringing all this together and applying these principles using JMeter, an open source performance testing tool that we use extensively throughout at Ten10. A little bit about me. I'm Ash Gawthorpe, one of the co-founders of Ten10. My background's in hardware and software engineering, development and architecture, with experience in technical testing and performance testing. As always, if you have a question at any point during today's webinar, please do use the chat window on the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll try and answer as many at the end as we can as possible. We have an hour today. That's a bit more time than we normally have, but then we have more stuff to cover. Essentially, the session's split into two. The first part will be looking at installing and setting up JMeter, introducing you to the concepts within it, and with the help of a couple of plugins, running through what you need to do to be able to record and run your first test. If this webinar was about teaching you how to code, then this part would be the equivalent of the sort of Hello World app. What I'll say is that JMeter is an excellent tool. It's very open-ended, and it can be extended and configured to do all kinds of different things. On the one hand, that's great because it gives you lots of flexibility, but on the other hand, it can be a little tricky to know where to start. So part one is really around showing you where to start and giving you that basic grounding and giving you the confidence to be able to explore further. Just due to time constraints, where I do need to skip over things, I'll highlight the point and suggest to you what needs to be done, what research you need to do in your own time. For example, we don't have time to cover regular expressions which are used in JMeter to extract variables from responses. Regular expressions are a really useful thing to know. They keep cropping up time and time again. I first came across them sort of 20 years ago when working with a number of the sort of Unix tools. They've been around since the 50s. And in their current state, they've been sort of recognizable in the form they're in now from the 70s and 80s. So definitely a long-lived sort of skill, and definitely one to invest some time in, I'd suggest, to learn. The other point is that in practice, there's a big difference between how JMeter is used out of the box for the simple test we'll be looking at in part one, and how it's used in anger in a large-scale performance test. With this in mind, the second part of today's session is around showing you an actual real-world performance test and the differences between the sort of hello world case and the reality. What I hope this will do is it will give you an appreciation of the differences. So when you come across issues in your own systems and your own testing, you can explore these in your own time and crucially have some guidance around what it is that you need to Google for in order to find the answer. Another point on JMeter, it is a great performance testing tool, but the reporting that comes out of the box isn't great. So in practice, we use a combination of open source tools with JMeter for reporting and monitoring. So that's Influx, an open source time series database that we use to capture stats from JMeter and aggregate the data. And then we use Grafana for monitoring and visualization. Grafana is very powerful and works well with Influx, but it also works well with other tools. As an example, in the second sort of part of this, that we'll be running through a performance test where the test environment is hosted in AWS, so Amazon's infrastructure as a service offering. As part of that, Amazon provide a service called CloudWatch, which is their network and infrastructure monitoring services. CloudWatch and Grafana work really well together. So Grafana is able to connect to CloudWatch and to take that data. And so what that then allows us to do, as you'll see within this test, is it allows us to aggregate all that data together in a common dashboard. So we can see the stats from JMeter graphed in real time, and we can also see the infrastructure performance stats and the networking stats from Amazon as well. And also there's one or two parts from Google Chrome as well, which we'll cover as well. really what we're doing here is we're using different open source tools and plugging them all together to provide a solution that works well. I'd encourage you to do the same for your own applications, and don't just try to get JMeter to kind of bend to your will. Often there are other tools out there which will play nicely with it, which are probably quite well suited to what you need to do. So maybe the overarching point there is that JMeter is a cog, a very important cog, but nonetheless a single cog in that whole sort of performance testing solution. Just one last point. I have a phobia of live demos. Things nearly always go wrong, and I've been doing this long enough to have had quite a few go wrong on me over the years, normally in front of a client when you're having lots of people together gathered around a room. When that happens, you find with one half of your brain you're having to try and fix the problem as you're going along, with the other half you're trying to talk and engage with people in the room and keep it going. I'm going to spare you that on this occasion. So the examples that we're going to be running through here and the tests we're going to be running through here, they have been pre-recorded in the sort of finest Blue Peter tradition. So I'll be showing you those, and I'll be talking over them as we go along. Okay, so let's get cracking with installing JMeter and running your first test. JMeter runs on pretty much any operating system that's able to run Java. OS X in this instance, but also Windows, Linux, and a ton of other more obscure ones. Although I'm installing this on OS X, the steps are very similar for Windows. So the first thing we need to do is to check the JRE, the Java runtime environment that is installed. And the way to do this is to pull up a console and to type Java space minus version. This will work on Windows and other operating systems as well. And what you should see is something like this, with the version of the JRE installed. So 1.8, which is Java 8 in this case. Now the next step is to install JMeter itself. I'm using Brew, a package manager for OS X that simplifies this process. It manages dependencies, versions, and everything else. In Windows, you'll need to download the latest stable zip from the JMeter website and extract it to the appropriate directory. If you Google JMeter Windows installation, you'll find detailed steps on how to do this. So that's now installed successfully. So the next step is to actually run JMeter. There's a number of ways that you can run JMeter. I am this way here. I'm actually running it in what it calls GUI mode. Now GUI mode is for test creation. It actually says it there. GUI mode is for sort of test creation debugging scripts. As the name implies, you have a GUI. When you're running JMeter properly in a large-scale performance test, then you have a number of components running JMeter which will be not configured. With the GUI, you'll have a number of agents deployed across different machines which are run in a different way, but we'll come on to that in a little while. So here we are. This is JMeter. It does take a little while to load, first time through on installation, and there we go. This is the GUI. The GUI is very dark, as you can see. That can be changed, and I actually prefer it to be changed, so we'll just do that in a second. So the first thing I just want to do here is to change the look and feel. It's just a preference thing, but my preferred look and feel is this one here. We will have to restart JMeter in order for it to take effect. Wait for it to restart. There we go. Just a point of personal preference, but this is my preference. So the first thing we need to do is we need to install the BlazeMeter plugin into Chrome. So in order to do this, we go to a tab, we click on Apps, we go to the Web Store, and we search the web store for BlazeMeter, and we see that there. And the first thing that we actually need to do is to add this to Chrome. There we go. So that is now added, and you can see here this little icon, which essentially means that the plugin is installed. So if we actually just go to this plugin here, there we go. We can see that, and we are able to enter the name of the test. So we are going to go in here and call it login test. For this part, we're going to use a site called automationpractice.com. So let's just navigate there now. We use this site a lot on our Academy automation program while we're teaching WebDriver. It's built using an e-commerce platform called PrestaShop, and this particular instance, automationpractice.com, is maintained by the Selenium team. One general point to note, actually, throughout this, we're only going to be running a small number of concurrent users against this site just to prove out the concepts. So please don't run a performance test against anybody's site or anybody's system without checking with the owners first. I guess a performance test without permission is essentially a denial of service attack. So this site allows you to browse a number of items, select the ones you're interested in, choose a size and add it to your basket. So fairly standard e-commerce type transactions. I've created a couple of users here, user 1 through user 5 at Ten10.com. Before you can use a user, you need to register it, although it doesn't take too long. What we're going to do now is we're actually just going to record a number of tests against this site. So you can see here I'm also signed in. In order to use all the features of the JMeter plugin, you do need to create an account with BlazeMeter. It's free and doesn't really take very long to do. But in order to use all the features we're going to use, you do need to create an account and log in and not just use an anonymous account. So the first thing we're going to do, we're going to start recording. If I actually just go back here, what you can see is a number of messages here that essentially that BlazeMeter plugin has recorded. So if let's sign in to the application, you can see the user's already registered there. So I will sign in. And you can see that, there we go, I've got user 1 is signed in, and it's telling me welcome to your account. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to just browse a couple of items. If we look at, if you see the URL at the bottom there, when I hover over these, you can see the different categories. So women is category 3, t-shirts is category 5, blouse is category 7, dress is category 8, t-shirt category 5. If we just click on this here. Here we go, and yep, I want to add that to cart, so that's gone in there as orange, size small, quantity 1 for $16.50. I'm now just going to proceed to the checkout. We can see here the summary of the order. Yep, I'm happy with that. I'm going to proceed. Choose my delivery address. Yep, the same one as the billing address. That's all fine. And now, if we have a look here, you need to agree to the terms of service. Proceed to checkout. And we have a payment option. We either pay by bank wire or pay by check. In order to make this site easier to use, it isn't connected to any payment providers or anything like that. So there we go. So by me doing that, it tells me that I must wire that account over to them and confirm my order. And there we go. We can see that your order on my store is complete. So if we go back to the plugin here, there we go. So what we're going to do, we're going to stop that, and we're actually going to export this to JMeter. So we need to download the .jmx file. So if I click on that, there we go. That will very shortly export it there. Excellent. So now that we've exported the JMX file, the next step is to load this into JMeter. So all we have to do here is we simply open, and there we go. So if we have a look here, we can see that the JMeter converter has essentially created all of these elements for us. So if we just have a quick look at these, for the time being, there's not really too much need to change any of these. These are setting a lot of the default behaviors which can be overridden. If we take this one, for example, the cache manager, this is saying we're going to clear the cache on each iteration, which in practice for a proper test we wouldn't want to do. We'd want to have a certain percentage of those users maintaining that cache information, and then the maximum number of elements in the cache set to 5,000, so that can be changed if you want to. If we have a look down here within the thread group, what we can see are all the different samplers that have recorded the messages for each step that we run within the test there. So for example, this is going to, this is just doing a HTTP GET on the base URL, and if we have a look around here somewhere, we should be able to, there we go, base URL is automationpractice.com. That's defined there, so it avoids you having to change it in each one of these samplers essentially. So what we can see here, if we look at this is the next one where we are clicking on my account. If we have a look at this one here, we can see this is the post which is done when we actually log in, passing in a couple of commands, my account authentication with a password, and the email address that we registered with. Again, if we look at some of the other things here, this is when we browsed to the teachers category, which was ID category 5, if you remember. And then within here, this is where we're actually adding the item to the basket. So here you can see that we're adding it to the cart. There's a token there, which we will come back to in a couple of minutes' time. And here we can see that this is now progressing the order. We can see that we're setting up the delivery address. We can see that we're setting up the shipping delivery options that we're wanting to pay. Via bank wire transfer, and so on and so forth. And then that final one there is the step where we actually do the order confirmation with an order ID and various other parameters that we're passing in. If we have a look within each one of these samplers, we can see there's an associated HTTP header manager, but also a timer here, a constant timer. And if we look at some of these, what BlazeMeter has actually done, it's actually recorded the user think time that I took while I was talking between taking an action. So each one of these is set here. For the purpose of our tests and for the purpose of debugging, this is going to take a little while to run if it's waiting that long between each activity. But what we're going to do now is we're actually just going to add a listener to here, a simple sort of view results tree listener, and we're just going to have a go at running this test and see what it does. So the test is now running, and what we should see here is each request as it goes through, and in here we can see the number of essentially the different assets that were retrieved off the back of that initial get there. We can look at the request, we can look at the response data that came back, there we go. And if we actually just take a look at this one here, what we can see is that this is our login request. We can see that it's posting the information around our username there, our password there, and if we look at the response back, then what we actually get back here is a 302, which means HTTP 302, which means that it's moved essentially a redirect. If we look here, we can see that it's redirecting us off to this URL there, and if we look here, this is what it's actually retrieving, where it gets a 200 back. If we look in the response data, then within here, what we're kind of looking for is, If I just pull up Chrome again, if I sign out, and then just very quickly sign back in again, and we can see here, welcome to your account. So within this response, we find that string there. What I'm actually just going to do now, so just remember that a second. What I'm actually going to do now, I'm going to go to the login again, and I'm actually going to change this information here. I'm actually going to change that so it's now an incorrect password, and I am just going to rerun the results again and see what we get here. If we just take a look at this one again, you can see that it is posting the new password. But what's bizarre here is that everything we're seeing is green. Now the reason for this is because there's nothing actually wrong with the HTTP level request and response going backwards and forwards. But if we actually look, so we get the same. We get the 200 back there. If we have a look at this one, and if we take a look at the response data here, what we will see is that if we just go back into Chrome a second and we sign out, and then we sign back in again, but with the incorrect password this time round, we can see we get this error result here. There is one error, authentication failed. And if we have a look in here now, there we go. We can see that we are getting it back. So whilst this is a green tick here, what we need to do is that we need to ensure that the user has actually logged in. So what we need to do is we essentially need to assert on the response which is coming back and confirm that that is as it should be. So now what we're going to do, we're now going to add an assertion to that particular sampler just to confirm the presence of that string welcome to your account when it actually issues a login. So if we go to authentication here, we go to add assertion. Now you can see there's a whole set of assertions here that JMeter can do. It can assert on a particular response code. It can assert on a size of response. It can assert on a duration of response. Sort of a MD5 hash sort of assertion there. There's a whole host of things, but the one that we're going to be looking at here is, and the most commonly used one, is the response assertion. Here we go. So you can see here that essentially you're able to match on a number of things, whether it contains that on a substring. So we're actually just going to say here that we want it to confirm here that it contains the string welcome to your account. So we have done that now. So now we are just going to run the test again, and if I actually just confirm we do have the invalid password in there. Yep, so if we run this now, and there we go. If we actually just have a look at this one here, we can see that it failed. What I'm going to do here, I'm going to stop the test. I'm now going to clear the test, and I'm now going to change that back again. There we go. And I am just going to rerun and confirm that it does pass this time. So this is very important to confirm that your test is actually doing what you expect it to do, i.e. in this case that it has actually logged the user in, and that it isn't just having something on the screen there which says, yep, that's all fine, off we go, crack on, whereas in actual fact it's not working. And there we go, we can see that this time round that has passed. So what I'd like to do next is to change my test. So instead of it having the hardwired email and password that were recorded with the BlazeMeter plugin, instead it'd be better to change this and abstract it away to a file, in this example a CSV file, containing a list of users and passwords. So as we ramp the test up, it uses the variety of different usernames and passwords. So really what we wanted to do here is add a data bank. So the way that we do that within JMeter, we add a config element, and here you can see there's a whole host of them, many different ways that you can actually get configuration and data banks into JMeter, but here we're going to use the CSV dataset config. And if we move that up here, but then just have a quick look at this, first thing that we need to give it is actually a username here. So there we go, there we have our users CSV file. We don't really need to change anything else. It's comma delimited the file rather than tab delimited. If I actually just bring this up here, there we go. Yep, you can see. There we go. That is just a fairly standard username CSV file, username, password as a column, headings, and then user 12345 that we've created within the application. So in order to use these within here, what we need to do is we need to indicate to JMeter that instead of actually using that hardwired password, we want to use a variable which we indicate using this notation here, and then we need to do the same for our username as well. And if I actually have a look at this, what we'll do is we'll just use two loops. I'll tell you, we'll have two going at the same time. There we go. Let's look at that. Yep, I'll clear that down, and then we'll just run this test. And so we can see both of them kind of running together there. And so we're just waiting for that authentication. Go. Now if we actually just have a look at this one here and what we're actually passing in there, so we can see we're actually passing in a password and user 11010. Now that's no surprise, because that's what we had hardwired in there as well. But if we actually have a look at this one, then we can see we're passing in a password of password, but our email is user2. That's just encoded there for @ten10.com. So essentially what we've done there is we've now replaced those hardwired values with our data bank, which is reading from our users.csv file there. I'll just stop this test. So far we've just looked at running the results and actually seeing the results here in this tree. But within JMeter there's a number of other number of other things that we can add here, essentially a number of other listeners that we can run. So at the moment we've got the view results one. Some of the main ones here, we've got the summary report, which essentially tracks some sort of standard metrics as it's going along. So you have the average time, the min time, the max time, the standard deviation, the error percentage, which is very useful. So you're able to work out essentially how many errors you're getting and what percentage of the transactions that you're running have errors, assuming that you've put those assertions in there. And there is another one as well that I will add here, which is the aggregate report as well. As you can see, this is a little bit more enriched in that you also have the percentiles, which, if you remember in the first webinar when we were talking about the non-functional requirements and being able to say, well, what's the 90th percentile, the 95th percentile, the 99th percentile, that will provide you with those values. So what I want to do here, on as well as that, actually, there's also graphs which can be added. So what I'm going to do here, I'm actually just going to just run that test again, but actually just show you this kind of summary report in terms of what that looks like. So as we're going along, we can see we have each label that's listed there. JMeter actually allows you to rename these. That's probably best practice. Actually, that's quite slack on my part that I haven't done that yet. So being able to rename these. So for example, that is better as sort of navigate to homepage. That's better as login as my account. That one as login, etc., etc., just to make them a little bit more readable. But here we go. We can see the number of samples. We can see the sort of average time in milliseconds, the min time, the max time, the standard deviation, and the fact that we aren't getting any errors. We also get a view of how many kilobytes we've received, how many kilobytes we've sent, and also the average bytes as well sent there. So that's the summary report. If we go to the aggregate report, we can see here that we actually just have a little bit more richer information. Now, because we only have 2 samples, this makes it a little bit tricky. But as you build thousands of samples, then you're able to line up those results in ascending order, and then that's what gives you your 90th, 95th, and 99th percentile. Take a look at the graph here. We can see that we are, in this case here, we're actually displaying the average. As you can see, the graphs don't look great, really. Now, what we will do is, in the second part of this exercise, when we're actually going to show you a proper sort of grown-up JMeter test running in anger on across distributed injectors on proper kind of server-side infrastructure, we'll show you what we use instead, and we have a kind of a custom listener which we've created ourselves, which essentially takes that data and just streams it into our own sort of reporting solution, which is built from a number of open source components, as I mentioned before, Influx and Grafana. So that concludes part 1, really. So just to summarise, so this has been a really simple and fast sort of whistle-stop tour of JMeter, really designed with the purpose of just getting you recording a test, running a test, seeing some of the features that it has and that it's able to perform. What I would say is there are lots and lots of resources and step-by-step run-throughs on the web. The documentation is available at that URL there, jmeter.apache.org. It's great as a reference, but if you're actually learning, I just, in general, actually just think YouTube is a much better way to learn. If you kind of just Google what it is you're looking for, chances are you'll find a half decent YouTube video showing exactly how to do it in JMeter. One point as well, we showed you the BlazeMeter plugin there. There are different ways to create tests, and in practice we tend to create the HTTP requests and just code those directly into JMeter. It's a little akin to, if you've got any automation experience, you can use that that sort of GUI recorder for that sort of record and playback type script. But in practice, it's actually better off sort of encoding that. It makes it more maintainable. You're able to abstract things away. You're able to just define things a little bit better. And in this case, it just makes it a little bit easier to see the wood for the trees, essentially, as well. And really just the fact that there's far more to JMeter than what I've covered here. In fact, we've barely scratched the surface. So I'd really encourage you to explore and to see what else you can find. So now we're kind of going to move on to part 2. And here what we're doing is we're showing you JMeter again, but this time this is recorded against a test that we performed against an actual system under test running in AWS with a fairly extensive performance test written in JMeter running against it, but also with our monitoring and reporting solution, because as you saw just at the end there, whilst JMeter does provide you with some sort of reporting and also some graphing capability, it's not the best, and there are definitely other and better things that you can do. So we'll move on to that now. Let's start with the transaction volume model. Really, this is a highly stylized spreadsheet that we use in order to model our different performance tests. There's a number of worksheets within it that make up the TVM, and here we have the summary sheet showing the version history essentially for the performance test. If we move on to base statistics here, and here we have a set of base statistics essentially giving a quick summary of the various transaction volume models that are contained within the tests. So essentially a baseline test, a single user test, normal, so this is our normal sort of business as usual website load. Then we move on to peak load, exceptional load, and spike load with the associated number of users, and finally a soak test. If we move on to user blend here, then this is showing the mix of the different users for a particular TVM split by user journey. So we can see here that everything adds up to 100%. If we move on to business processes, this again should be familiar to everybody that saw the last webinar, but really we're detailing the steps for each journey. So the first user, Digio1, which is the bouncing user, which is just a single user browsing to a page. Digio2 is a little bit more complicated, where the users can navigate to the home page, they can select a product for purchase, add it to the basket, and finally fulfill that and pay for it. And if we move down, we can see that this is defined for each of the 10 user journeys that we saw previously in the user blend. This tab here is Databanks. Now these are used throughout our tests, containing the parameterized information that we actually load at runtime for each test. So we can see here that we have, for example, user details, login details. If we move on to the TVM proper, so this is the first TVM, the baseline, and the important thing here is that the number of concurrent virtual users is 1 throughout every single user journey. So it'll only have 10 users when it's running, but the purpose of this is really just to pipe clean and to ensure that everything works. A little bit more detail again on this one, so we can see the individual steps defined from the earlier sheet, and we can also start to put a bit more detail in here. So we have a target response time, the think time that we associate. So this is essentially the amount of time that the user would spend thinking before actually taking some action which moves them on to the next step. and as well we have the number of iterations, and as you can see in this particular profile, they're all set to 1. And that's it really. So if we, everything's really set to 1. If we move on to the normal load, so this is our normal web load, we can see that the concurrent virtual users start to increase. So 12, 6, 6, and throughout and so forth. If we move on to the peak load, then we see the concurrent virtual users increasing more. 24, 12. Now getting all this information into JMeter can be a rather time-consuming process, as we saw before, but we have a plugin. So if we start JMeter now and just wait for it to finish loading, so what this plugin does, it allows us to load our TVM spreadsheet that we entered, and we'll just find it a second. Here we go. So if we open that up and just wait for that to load, here we go. So we can see we have a number of parameters, and the problem is that people can change the format of them. So in order for this to work, in order for it to read it accurately, it needs to have certain information about the spreadsheet. So what it's looking for here are certain columns and labels. So for example, the think time, it will look for that particular column header, think time brackets S, and use that as the basis for the data. So we've taken care just about when we opened it to make sure we haven't changed anything else. But the only thing we need to do here is to enter a project code. So the project code is used to uniquely identify a project, and when it's collecting data, that's grouped together under a project, which later just makes it easier to search and find that. So if we click OK, what we'll see here is that it has read the spreadsheet, it's processed it, and it's generated a skeleton test plan. If we look, for example, at Digio1, the bounce user, we can see the 10 user journeys. The first one, the single step, just to browse to the page, and we can see that in there. And if we each individual HTTP request that is required and makes up that particular step, and add them into this particular transaction controller. So at the moment it's just a template, it's just a skeleton. If we look in our think time, we can see it's added that, but notice it's actually configured the think time into a parameter, because the majority of the spreadsheet pretty much uses the same think time. And if we look up here, we can see that the default think time is set to 10 seconds, which matches the majority of the entries in the spreadsheet. If we change the default, then it just propagates all the way through the scripts without us having to change it. If you remember from the spreadsheet, what we see here is that we declared the second script different think time for the first and the last step. So the first step there has 20 seconds, 20,000 milliseconds, and the last one has a think time of 3 seconds or 3,000 milliseconds. If we go back to the spreadsheet here, we can actually see that 20 and 3. There we go. Okay, so one of the other things to mention is to look at the JMeter scripts that have been generated, and we can see all the databanks that we declared on the tabs in the spreadsheet have been added in for us. It's also created a set of load execution profiles for us. We can see here we have baseline, as we can see just one user declared for all of them. When we move on to normal load, we can see the number of users increases, and then we look for peak, for soak, and we can see that each one of those reflects the TVM tab in the worksheet. So the actual generator will generate one execution profile for each worksheet that you have within the spreadsheet that begins with the name TVM on the worksheet. Other things to point out, it's included an aggregate report, a summary report. These are very useful when analysing the statistics. The aggregate report produces by default a set of statistics including the 90th, 95th, 99th percentile, whereas the summary report doesn't have that level of detail, but it gives you average, min, max, standard deviation, etc. Rather handily, it also gives you the error percentage, and one of the newer features of JMeter is the ability to be able to sort by a particular column. So that's a very handy thing when you're running, to be able to look at the error percentages and actually see which tests are causing you the most problems. One other thing that we've added on here that we generate as standard, we have our 1010 influx listener. So what this does is this writes all of the received statistics from JMeter in real time into influx, which then forms the primary source for our Grafana instance, which essentially is our primary reporting tool. Now, in the tradition of Blue Peter, here's one that we've created earlier, a test that we're running. So you can see this is running now. This particular test has a bit more detail in it. Obviously, it started off with a TVM, so things like the normal load ones here, but they've been enriched and a number of other ones have been added to it. And right now you can see we're running this on one injector, UK7 only, which we've created especially for a test that we needed to run here, only running on a single remote injector. So if we go up here to run remote start and remote stop, we can see that that's the only injector running of a list that we're able to stop. So currently only running on the server with an internal IP address of ending in 10. So if we look at errors here, so very important to keep an eye on this when it's running and actually see the errors as they come along in real time. As you can see, this is quite boring or good depending on your point of view, because we haven't got any errors so far. So that's kind of it, really, sort of showing it running at kind of at scale with a proper grown-up test. If we just have a quick look now at Grafana. So this is our Grafana instance, which is running here in real time, collecting stats from influx and just rendering those. So if we look here, we can see that these were the statistics from a run that we aborted about half an hour ago, and you can see there this is the run that we've just started a little while ago there. So it's showing a steady ramp up that we'd expect to see there, in line with our load profile that we created. So from a base of 0, steadily increasing, sort of increasing for the next few minutes. So in Grafana on this particular project, we've got about 80 different graphs all running, all updating in real time. We won't run through all of these, but really it allows you to see sort of in real time any problems as they occur or anything you need to keep an eye on. So we also have these windows here which show the errors, with real-time stats on the left and errors on the right. Ideally we don't want to see any errors on the right hand side, but it's important that when you're running a test, if an error does appear, you can see them straight away. So moving down a little, so a number of different tests that are running here. Remember all the different 10 user journeys that we had in our profile, they're all in here reported individually, and in fact we've added some more tests since that TVM that we showed you was first created. This is quite interesting. One other script we've developed quite interesting, which isn't actually a JMeter script but uses the same reporting mechanism. This is a Puppeteer script which allows you to run real browser testing in much the same way as you might do with Selenium. But one of the useful stats you can get out of this is this first meaningful paint. Now this is a statistic which Google have contributed their thoughts or thought processes towards, but it's very useful because it's the point where the user is effectively able to interact with the website. So two sets of stats here. The first meaningful paint, the time to there, and then the load event as well on the right hand side. Now, one of the good things about Grafana is that you can do a whole host of these. So even though they've been updated in real time, you can interact with them, switch on, switch off individual profiles, as we're doing here. Yeah, and we can actually multiply select them, or show all of them, or none of them, or one of them. Similarly, we can actually drill down into an individual one itself. So they're sorted alphabetically, but we can also sort them by the columns here. So if we want to show them by slowest, we can click on there, and there we go. So that's confirm payment, or any of the column headings that we want to sort them by. So taking nearly 4 seconds with a maximum of 6.7 and a minimum of just a little over 3. Now if we actually edit this and actually look at this in a bit more detail, we can see the times that are on here. If we have a sample rate of every 2 minutes, and then we have the sample rate filters here showing 2 minutes, which can be configured to different sampling rates according to what we're looking for. So what this does is it aggregates the data within the influx database itself. So this is what this allows us to do. So if we change that back to 2 minutes, because the sample rate is actually quite low, it doesn't really make too much difference. But what's going on here is that we are aggregating the data over that 2 minute interval. And in this particular case, we're grabbing the 95th percentile of all of the measured statistics at the underlying database side, every single transaction, and everyone's recorded as a statistic. But what Influx is doing here, and Grafana is reporting on, Influx is aggregating the data within the database and just reporting on what we're querying there across these 2 minute time buckets. And then Grafana's plotting it on this graph. And of course, the averages that we see here are the averages of the 95th percentile over the duration of the test. So that's kind of just showing that test running here. So yeah, we'll move on to the next bit now. The other thing I wanted to just briefly show you is around the analysis and reporting that can go on within JMeter, within Grafana, and specifically within sort of a grown-up performance test. So if we go back to the to our Grafana instance again, you can see all the graphs, all the data that we captured from that last test that I was describing to you before. And if we scroll down here, we did come across an issue, which is on a particular machine, a particular server, and hopefully everybody can see loud and clear that that's certainly an issue. So the CPU on the Hybris admin box, you can see that when we started the test about sort of 10 past 2, it ramped up very, very quickly and then just saturated at 100% CPU. Now clearly that's something that you'd want to identify, and that's a bottleneck that you would want to investigate and look at what's causing that issue essentially before moving on. The other thing I just want to show you, we mentioned various open source tools and how they can augment JMeter. So Grafana is great in that it produces lots of data and lots of information which you can query both in real time but also historically. But crucially, we created this sort of metrics manager tool, which essentially just allows us to extract all of the various graphs and information out of Grafana and to publish it into a performance testing report. Because one of the issues is that what you want to be able to do is, for each performance test, you actually want to be able to go back and see what was happening at a point in time. Now, Grafana does allow you to do that, but equally that's not very easy to be able to transport around and to be able to use. So we created this, which essentially creates a Word document with a standard reporting template that includes all of those graphs that we that we have on the Grafana sheet. Now, in days of old, we used to do this by hand. As you can imagine, that is a devil of a job, very, very involved, and takes a huge amount of time. So instead, we just wrote this little app which does it for us. And I'd suggest you sort of really, if you're going to find yourself running a lot of tests and having to generate a lot of performance test reports, you probably want to consider something similar. So here we can see we're just loading in various bits of metadata around the doc author, the doc date, the title of the document, all of which just allows you to clearly differentiate between a performance test. You can see when it was performed, you can see what the results were. Now there is a little bit, and crucially the document version, that's very, very important. So you're able to differentiate between different versions of a particular test that you ran. So this is going to run now. Unfortunately, when we recorded this video, we omitted a step, which was to select which of those graph images that you can see should be in scope for the document. And what you can see here is that the performance test report that we've created is entirely empty because none of those graphs are selected. So what we're going to do now is we're quickly realizing this as we're running down here. So we'll just go back to the Metrics Manager app in a second after throwing this doc away. There we go. And crucially, remember to click the Select All box there and generate report again. Now this is essentially extracting the information. It's producing bitmaps of those graphs and then just ties it together and strings it together into our standard reporting template, using and populating that metadata around the version, title, date and author, and injecting that into the document itself. So this does take a couple of seconds to run, but hopefully that doc will return very shortly. Here we go, and we can see there that it's quite a robust document. It's quite substantial, but it does allow you to archive that fairly easily or to email that to different interested third parties without necessarily having to give them access to your Grafana instance. If you can give them access to that Grafana instance, and that's the best way to do it, is they can run their own queries on that data and do their own investigation. And so here really this is just a point in the document to the only part that needs to be filled in by hand, which is essentially to look at what was observed and what were any errors that were found and kind of what to do about it. So here we can see there's something wrong with the CPU on the Hybris admin box that needs to be investigated. So that really sort of summarizes the reporting part. As you can see, the document, the graphs that Grafana produces are pretty good looking actually. Didn't take that long to pull this little plugin together just to be able to create these graphs and to label them all. But as you can imagine, if you didn't have access to that, you were trying to pull this together by hand from capturing graphs on the screen and then pasting them into the document. It's a heck of a lot of work, and every time something changes, you have to go and update all the different figure numbers and everything else. So a little bit of time invested up front in all these tools can save a great deal of time further down the line over and over again. And I guess that's kind of an important point really. If there is some return on investment through investing a little bit in developing something, then it's definitely worth you doing that across these tools. As I mentioned before, everything we've shown you today really is a combination of freely available open source tools, just pulled together in different ways to be able to derive more value from them. And here we are just inserting a link in there and a reference to the actual figure itself where the error is actually reported. There we go. Okay, well I think that's really just about all we have time for today. Well, I hope that's been useful for you. As I say, really the intention was to sort of approach this from two angles really. The first one was to give you that grounding and introduction, almost that kind of hello world application in JMeter, to give you a few pointers and hopefully a little bit of confidence to be able to pursue that further yourselves and hopefully to be able to find your way through the various assets and training materials that exist out there on the web for JMeter. And then in part 2, looking at, as things mature, sort of how much further you can take it in terms of running a robust large-scale performance test, building on sort of those load profile and load modeling spreadsheets and ideas that we ran through in the last webinar, and then pulling all that together really. So I'll say thank you very much for attending today. I'm aware that we have really run out of time and we don't really have that much time for questions. I think there have been a couple of questions. We'll make sure we reply directly to people that have asked those. We have all that information. In terms of what's coming up next, we have 2 potential further webinars planned in performance testing around the client-driven approach. So this is rather than using this protocol-based approach, whereas you've seen we're just firing HTTP requests backwards and forwards, but actually driving real browsers or real instances of a fat client application or a mobile app. And that second one around service virtualization. So being able to take those various third-party APIs or even internal APIs that a system uses and being able to virtualize those. So rather than having to bring that large-scale test environment with you, you're able to test against a simpler virtualized version of it that you have full control over. A little bit of feedback we've had is that people would also like to see some automation webinars as well, so we may well change tack on those. If you have a particularly strong preference around what you'd like to see, then please fire that in and let us know. We will endeavour to get this webinar available for streaming up onto the website, just to make you aware that this one's quite a bit bigger than the previous one, so it might take us a few days to get that up there, but when it does, we'll send an email around. So that really just remains for me to say thank you very much for attending, and hope you enjoy your day. Thanks. Bye.